Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It is great to see so many familiar faces, but a lot more unfamiliar faces. Really happy about that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gabrielle Dankanich, and I'm chair here at Young Americans for Freedom at Catholic University. And tonight we are joined with Jack Butler. Jack Butler is submissions editor at National Review Online, media fellow for the Institute of Human Ecology, and a 2022-2023 Robert Novak Journalism Fellow at the Fund for American Studies. He is the host and producer of the Young Americans podcast and is a former research assistant to Jonah Goldberg at American Enterprise Institute. After attending NatCon 3, the National Conservative Conference in Miami, Jack Butler is well aware of National Conservatism's core principles, and speaking on behalf of CUA Young Americans for Freedom, I can say that we are excited to hear more about this diverging branch within the conservative movement and what it really means and how to respond. During our Q&A period, you may not hear your voice through the microphone, but your question will be heard on the live stream. Thank you, and join me in welcoming Jack Butler.
All right. Thank you, Gabrielle, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, YAF and the Institute for Human Ecology for hosting me at this beautiful campus. Since I'm at a Catholic campus, here's a confession. Somehow I had never heard of CUA before moving to Washington, D.C., despite growing up Catholic. When I was doing my college search, I did come to D.C., but for some reason I didn't visit here, even though I did visit the formerly Catholic University of America called Georgetown. But one day, when I first moved to D.C. after graduating from college, not Georgetown, Hillsdale if anyone's curious, I was walking around Capitol Hill. Then I looked north and saw a large dome off in the distance. I was pretty confused, and I'll tell you why. I was new to the area, but I was pretty sure the Capitol was in the other direction. So not long after that, I went for a run northward and discovered CUA. Or as I saw it described in a news story recently, that Catholic University of America. I don't know where that came from. But now I'm here a lot. I have friends who go here, others who teach here, and still others who live nearby. I'm fortunate enough to be affiliated with the Institute for Human Ecology, and I live about 1.5 miles away. Now I know the precise distance because what brings me to this campus most often is the run up the Metropolitan Branch Trail, which, is that way, I think? So I come to you tonight dressed a little bit differently from how I usually am when I'm here. I also come to you to answer a question. What is national conservatism? Conservatives love to interrogate themselves. Former National Review editor Frank Meyer once released an anthology titled What is Conservatism?, in which he and other conservatives attempted to answer the question, what is conservatism? I know that title must be really shocking. My favorite answer was supplied by National Review founder William F. Buckley Jr., who I hope is familiar to this room, but he credited Richard Weaver, and here's the definition that Buckley gave from Weaver of conservatism. A paradigm of essences toward which the phenomenology of the world is in continuing approximation. Got that? That about sums it up, I think, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. What does that mean? But look at me, name-checking these heroes from conservatism's past. I'm supposed to be here to assess something new, something in the present. If I were feeling cheeky, I could simply pronounce that national conservatism is a conservatism that is national and be on my way back down the Metropolitan Branch Trail. But that would make this speech a waste of my time and yours, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I've decided to share the results of my investigation into national conservatism. One I undertook in the same spirit that led me all those years ago to wonder what that big dome off in the distance was. In doing so, I discovered that national conservatism, rightly understood, is in fact neither national nor conservative. And these key defects make me worried that national conservatism is inadequate to the very real challenges of our time. So I would say that includes many of the challenges national conservatives have themselves identified. Indeed, what often seems to distinguish national conservatives from other kinds is that they're angry. Angry at the left, which has done much to be angry about, but also angry at some on the right. People like me, associated with institutions like National Review and YAF, who are supposedly thoughtlessly committed to what gets mocked as zombie Reaganism or Conservatism Inc., or people who don't know what time it is. Pick your preferred insult here. There are many circulating these days, mostly on Twitter, which is a more wretched hive of scum and villainy than the Mos Eisley Cantina could ever hope to be. So, is national conservatism a new hope for the right? Or something else? At first, it was hard to tell. So I was grateful to discover one account rebutting certain myths about national conservatives, or NatCons for short. Do NatCons oppose the free market? No, they admire it, but recognize that it is not perfect. Are NatCons isolationists? No, they embrace alliances and support the national sovereignty of other nations, but reject the stale, discredited consensus of interventionism. Are NatCons all Trump fans? No. Many of them voted for Trump, but would welcome any politician who welcomed them. So, there we go. Myths busted. Time for me to hop onto the Metropolitan Branch Trail? No, not yet. My investigation did not end there. For the past few years, NatCons have gathered at the National Conservatism Conference, also called NatCon. So NatCons at NatCon, if you're trying to keep track of things. This year, I decided to attend the third one. So in Miami, Florida, where the weather is too hot and the air conditioning is too cold, I discovered some myths about national conservatism. The NatCon admiration for free markets had some rather large buts. That's one T. The statements praising them were followed after but by caveats so massive that they called into question the first part of the statement. The isolationism of NatCon turned out to be both more and less of a myth than I expected. More because even as some NatCons support Ukraine as an exemplar of national sovereignty, many others question the US interest there. Less because, well, there was a large Hungarian presence. More about the Hungarians later. As for Trump, he did not speak at NatCon 3, despite being a Florida man, whereas 3 other Florida men, Governor Ron DeSantis and Senators Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, did. DeSantis was introduced as the next president to fierce applause. But throughout the conference, speakers identified Trump as by far the biggest threat to the left. So with my myths muddled, I was back to square one. Fortunately, there have been other attempts to define national conservatism. The 2 most prominent this year have involved Yoram Zoni as author of the recent book Conservatism Rediscovery and as chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation. That foundation has spearheaded all 3 NatCons. Earlier this year, it was responsible for the release of the National Conservatism Statement of Principles. Consulting these resources, I thought I could understand national conservatism. And indeed, I could. But I was uncomfortable with some of what I found. For one thing, national conservatism is not entirely national. Now, on first hearing this, you must think me mad. Why, it's right there in the name. True. It's also true that, if you ask most national conservatives, what sets them apart from other kinds of conservative is a focus on national issues: immigration, trade, foreign policy. This is welcome in some ways, but you don't have to be a NatCon to care about our nation's borders, our nation's economy, or our nation's presence abroad. The conservative tradition furnishes a rich history of debate and discussion about these very things. I heartily recommend Matthew Continetti's book, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, for an account of this. But for just one example, the Sharon Statement, which should be familiar to this audience, declares that we will be free only so long as the national sovereignty of the United States is secure. But NatCons sometimes drain conservatism of much of its national, that is, distinctly American, meaning. Let's take a look at the National Conservatism Statement of Principles. It contains some commendable things, such as support for national sovereignty and the rule of law. The statement defines the rule of law as, quote, living in accordance with the Constitution of 1787, the amendments to it, duly enacted statutory law, and the great common law inheritance. But nowhere in the statement is the Declaration of Independence mentioned, or even implied. Some might call that a significant silence. What accounts for it? I cannot say for sure, but I suspect it is the influence of Hazoni. In Conservatism Rediscovery, his book, Hazony reads the Declaration out of the American political tradition. The Declaration, you see, was a bad Jeffersonian Enlightenment document, whereas the Constitution was a Washingtonian Anglo-American document. The former was a kind of impetuous lashing out in favor of freedom by the rebellious colonists. The latter was them returning to their senses and essentially restoring the very political order they had just thrown off, just with King George not in charge. Everything bad in American history has descended from the Declaration, whereas everything good in American history has descended from the Constitution. The end. Or is it? No, it's not. Hazony's book frames this understanding of history and the Anglo-American conservatism that emerges from it as a rediscovery. But as one reviewer pointed out, it is theory, not previously buried but now rediscovered stone tablets. And there are all sorts of flaws with it as theory. Start with the Declaration itself. It was not one-off twaddle by Thomas Jefferson. He was a primary force behind it, but he also wrote it with John Adams, the kind of figure Hazony otherwise drafts into his vision of what conservatism is supposed to be. Near the end of his life, Jefferson said the Declaration was, quote, intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. So much for the Declaration. What about the Constitution? It's true that the Constitution was a movement more in the direction of national authority after the Articles of Confederation. But was it merely a restoration of British government, as Hazony implies? Well, what did the Constitution's primary advocates say? If only there were some set of papers where the Federalists, the name for the Constitution's advocates, had collected their arguments. Oh wait, there is! And wouldn't you know it? It's called the Federalist Papers. And as another Hazony reviewer has pointed out, they don't exactly line up with Hazony's argument. In Federalist number 1, for example, Alexander Hamilton, another figure Hazony wants to draft into his kind of conservatism, argues that the ratification of the Constitution presents an opportunity for Americans to decide, quote, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Why does Hamilton believe Americans are capable of designing a new government? Because, as he wrote in Federalist number 9, quote, the science of politics, like most other sciences, has received great improvements, including new ways to limit government power. And in Federalist number 84, Hamilton explicitly distinguished what the framers of the Constitution were proposing from its British precedents. In the British context, Bills of Rights are, quote, stipulations between kings and their subjects, and therefore have no application to constitutions professedly founded upon the power of the people and executed by their immediate representatives and servants. In our system, Hamilton continues, the people surrender nothing, and as they retain everything, they have no need of particular reservations. So contemporary evidence supports the idea that, though America owed a great deal to what came before, and still does, it was nonetheless consciously distinct. During the ratification debates, it was actually the Constitution's opponents, creatively called the Anti-Federalists, who believed it was a restoration of British monarchical forms. As another reviewer of Hazony's book pointed out, quote, Hazony argues that the Anti-Federalists were right in their analysis, but wrong in their value judgment. Most historical assessments judge the American founding as something new. Hazony does not. He says, it is easy to overestimate how much of a change was involved in the establishment of Republican government in America. But in the radicalism of the American Revolution, historian Gordon Wood argues that the American Revolution was radical. Here's what Wood says. The Revolution did not just eliminate monarchy and create republics. It actually reconstituted what Americans meant by public or state power and brought about an entirely new kind of popular politics and a new kind of democratic officeholder. The American Revolution was not the French Revolution, and thank God for that. In important ways, it was held in check, but we should not underestimate the power of its change. Wood was not the only subsequent interpreter of the founding to understand its power. Abraham Lincoln, whom Hazony also drafts into his pantheon of good Anglo-Americans, likewise confounds Hazony's analysis. Hazony writes that, quote, although Lincoln comfortably mixed Jeffersonian rhetoric with his imposing biblical imagery, his policies as president were in a tradition that Federalists would have easily recognized. But Lincoln did more than comfortably mix these things. Jeffersonian rhetoric was central to his time as a public figure. Of the Declaration, Lincoln wrote that he gave, quote, all honor to Jefferson for introducing into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. He also said, I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln's understanding of the relationship between the Declaration and Constitution challenges Hazony's argument. Lincoln believed the two documents were inextricably linked. The Declaration, with its principle of liberty to all, was what Lincoln called the apple of gold, around which the Constitution, which he called the picture of silver, was framed. So I don't know about you, but what's good enough for Lincoln is good enough for me, and has been good enough for the actual American political tradition. To take an example from Lincoln's time, it took the moral force of the Declaration, together with the Constitution, to end slavery. So we should consider ourselves fortunate, not weirdly embarrassed, as Hazony seems to be, for this Declaration's centrality in American political life. What accounts for Hazony's embarrassment? I'm not exactly sure. At my most critical, I'm inclined to wonder if it arises from an attempt to create a new political tradition that he thinks better serves his current interests. But that would be at least as much a form of abstract rationalism as anything the Declaration attempted. And it would serve ultimately to alienate oneself from the American context. In its more benign forms, such thought would elide the distinctions between the American and British political traditions. We have already seen how they are distinct, though to confuse them is perhaps somewhat understandable. Though right now, I think we should especially be grateful for the differences, if you've been paying any attention to British politics over the past month and a half. Also understandable, if a little more idiosyncratic, is how Hazony's reading of American politics seems to be filtered through that of Israel, where he now lives. As one Hazony reviewer has argued, quote, despite his admiration for the Anglo-American past, the core of Hazony's conservatism is a form of Zionism built around an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible as the primary guide to modern politics, end quote. Now, Israel is an incredible nation with an amazing people and is a worthy ally of the United States. But it is different from the United States. Less understandable, however, is when an allegedly national conservatism breeds contempt for one's own nation. There has been no better example of this than Rod Dreher. An editor at the American Conservative, keep that name in mind, Dreher worked with Hazony and others to draft the National Conservatism Statement of Principles. About a decade ago, Dreher, quite nobly, returned to the part of Louisiana where he was born in an attempt to reconnect with his heritage and with his family. But in the intervening years, as he was consumed with pessimism about America, he became one of the most fervent defenders of the government of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Within the past few months, Dreher has abandoned his family in Louisiana for Budapest, Hungary's capital. That is a curious form of nationalism, especially for someone who works at the American Conservative. Whatever popularity Orban might have with his people, why should even a good American nationalist be so invested in a European nation the size of Indiana with the population of Michigan? Any honest attempt to compare our national situations or traditions would find almost nothing to go on. And yet Dreher is hardly the only conservative these days singing Hungary's praises. Left out of these hosannas, however, is any recognition of the possibility that Hungary might be trying to launder its reputation through Americans. Such Americans rarely discuss how Orban's government has played nice with that of Russia, or how it has invited Chinese investment. But it would be problematic for a supposedly American nationalism, to be focused on another nation, even absent these other factors. This is what can happen when you attempt to untether your nationalism from America's actual political tradition, which is why that tradition is what should motivate American conservatism. At its best, America's tradition is an accessible one, powerful enough that a refugee from Cold War-era communist Hungary can say to his family that they were fleeing to America because we were born in Americans, but in the wrong place. National conservatism at its worst inverts this, redefining the American political tradition so that it somehow finds better expression elsewhere. Conservatives thinking about how best to confront our very real problems, many of them identified by national conservatives, should root themselves in America. So much for the national part of national conservatism. How about the conservative part? Here, there are also flaws. I've already detailed the most obvious one, but I'll elaborate. American conservatism's charge is to defend this nation's founding, the principles that undergird it, the inheritance it depends on, and the virtues it inculcates. William F. Buckley Jr. understood this. In the very first issue of National Review, Buckley lamented that America had abandoned, quote, its tradition of fixed postulates having to do with the meaning of existence, with the relationship of the state to the individual, of the individual to his neighbor, so clearly enunciated in the enabling documents of our republic. A decade and a half later, he said that the historical responsibility of the conservatives is clear. It is to defend what is best in America at all costs against any enemy, foreign or domestic. But, as we've seen, national conservatism can have a faulty understanding of what American conservatives are actually supposed to conserve. To which Hazony might reply, so what? Conservatism, a rediscovery, has contempt for post-war American conservatism, which Hazony believes was ultimately a failure. As he puts it, the years, quote, from the founding of William Buckley's National Review in 1955 to the end of Margaret Thatcher's ministry in Britain in 1990, are often described as a time of resurgence for Anglo-American conservatism. No doubt there is a measure of truth to this, but in an important sense, it is also false. That's what he says. Why? Because conservatism became liberalism after the Cold War ended, and liberalism proved unable to stand up to what Hazony calls the woke Marxism, whose reign began in 2020. That's right, National Review, YAF, Buckley, Reagan. Ultimately, it wasn't good enough for Hazony. So is it time for me to head back down the Metropolitan Branch Trail again? No, not yet. I will have more to say about the challenges of conservatism in recent decades in a few minutes. But, as we've seen, Hazony's understanding of Anglo-American conservatism leaves something to be desired. So while it is nice for Hazony to, quote, place Buckley and his enterprise within the Anglo-American conservative tradition, I think Buckley can decide for himself what tradition he places himself into. Besides, it's not really Buckley Hazony takes issue with. It's Buckley's and our colleague Frank Meyer, the intellectual progenitor of fusionism. An attempted harmonization of the freedom-oriented and virtue-oriented strains Meyer believed ran through the Western tradition. In a sense, I'm grateful that Hazony has given Meyer some attention. He was an important figure in the early years of National Review. One of the many ex-communists to populate its masthead in those years, Meyer was a rigorous, systematic thinker. Buckley called him conservatism's air traffic control. Unfortunately, Meyer died in 1972. Before then, he still did exert a significant influence over National Review and conservatism as a whole. But his early death remains a great loss for conservatism. That's because Meyer's thought is a rich vein for conservatives to mine. So rich, in fact, that it is well beyond the scope of my remarks tonight to explain it in full. But it is worth, at the very least, correcting Hazony's misrepresentation and understanding Meyer as he understood himself. Hazony's argument about Meyer goes something like this. Meyer's view that virtue must be freely chosen to be truly virtuous leads to a highly limited role for the state. To Hazony, this is just an expression of rigid, dogmatic Enlightenment liberalism. Those are Hazony's words. Forget that Meyer himself wrote that there is much in classical liberalism that conservatives must reject. Hazony believes that he has Meyer dead to rights when he quotes him as saying that freedom is the aspect of the nature of men which political institutions exist to serve. Hazony is aghast. Is it really possible that freedom is the only quality that is essential to human nature? He asks. This shortchanges Meyer, however. To believe in freedom as an aim of political life is not to enshrine it as a sole imperative. It is perfectly consistent with Meyer's and the founders' views of the Constitution, for the Constitution, by securing freedom, to create the conditions under which individuals, their families, and their communities can foster the virtues central to human flourishing, as one Hazony reviewer put it. But Hazony doesn't just misrepresent Meyer. Rather, he imputes his interpretation of Meyer's views to the entirety of post-war American conservatism. And he faults Meyer for conservatism either transforming into or failing to confront liberalism and now woke Marxism. That's a lot of blame to lay at the feet of someone who died 50 years ago. Fortunately, it's not the case. If anything, conservatism's present challenges arise from abandoning fusionism after the Cold War, not overly embracing it. But again, more on that in a few minutes. This national conservative discontent with the tradition of post-war conservatism shows up in other places as well, in ways that seem to confuse national conservatives. Let's return to the statement of principles I mentioned earlier. It contains a section on economics that, as with much of the statement, includes a lot I can agree with. Here's a quote from it. We believe that an economy based on private property and free enterprise is best suited to promoting the prosperity of the nation and accords with traditions of individual liberty that are central to the Anglo-American political tradition. Again, that Anglo-American political tradition shows up. But sure, fine. The statement continues. We reject the socialist principle, which supposes that the economic activity of the nation can be conducted in accordance with a rational plan dictated by the state. Okay, great. So far, I see little out of step with the Sharon statement, which calls the market economy the single economic system compatible with the requirements of personal freedom and constitutional government, and the most productive supplier of human needs. But here comes one of those big buts, 1T, I mentioned earlier. Here it comes. But the free market cannot be absolute, the statement reads. Economic policy must serve the general welfare of the nation. The statement then goes on to lament that globalized markets empower America's enemies, weaken America economically, and enable transnational corporations to flood the country with goods that weaken national virtue. In response to this, quote, a prudent national economic policy should promote free enterprise, but it must also mitigate threats to the national interest, aggressively pursue economic independence from hostile powers, nurture industries crucial for national defense, and restore and upgrade manufacturing capabilities critical to the public welfare. It adds helpfully that crony capitalism, the selective promotion of corporate profit-making by organs of state power, should be energetically exposed and opposed. There's a lot to unpack there. I should start by agreeing that the free market cannot be absolute. But while markets have presented many challenges to America, some that break my heart as an Ohio native, the picture the statement paints of America's economic situation is a bit hyperbolic and reductive, and selective. Both trade and automation have played a role in reducing manufacturing employment at the same time that manufacturing remains a significant driver of our economy. And while I agree with Adam Smith and Milton Friedman that national security is an acceptable free market exception, we already have many policies in place to that end. Also, you'd be shocked how many people will try to take advantage of that exception. If you want to know why sugar is so much more expensive in the US than elsewhere, thank the Florida Sugar Lobby's success in making its product a national security priority. There are also contradictions in this part of the statement of principles. As one assessment of the statement has argued, the attempt to, quote, restore and upgrade manufacturing capabilities critical to the public welfare sounds a lot like industrial policy, in which the government picks winners and losers in the economy. If we're going to see more of that, based on past examples, we're going to see more of the same crony capitalism the statement ostensibly condemns. And if we're going to see an expanded role for the government economically, it's very hard to envision how we'll achieve a, quote, drastic reduction in the scope of the administrative state. Yet this is a policy priority the statement explicitly invokes. So I am not completely closed off to government policy in this area. I think China presents a real threat to the US. And I think we should consider actions such as banning TikTok and reviving Vine as a state-backed enterprise. I miss Vine. I don't know about the rest of you. But we should be very careful with how we do such things. You won't beat China by becoming China. We should also be careful to have a correct understanding of America's constitutional architecture. On this subject, the National Conservatism Statement of Principles contains a good deal with which I agree. We believe in a strong but limited state subject to constitutional restraints and a division of powers, the statement reads. It continues, we recommend a drastic reduction in the scope of the administrative state and the policy-making judiciary that displaces legislatures representing the full range of a nation's interests and values. Great! However, it errs in one key respect. We recommend the Federalist Principle, which prescribes a delegation of power to the respective states or subdivisions of the nation so as to allow greater variation, experimentation, and freedom. That's the statement's understanding of federalism. Hazony, in his book, similarly faults the great Russell Kirk for, quote, defending the customs of the Midwest and South against American national conservatives such as Hamilton. Now, if I were in a movie or if I were a sound effects guru, there would be a record scratch noise here. So please imagine it in your heads instead. What's up with this? So as to allow greater variation, experimentation, and freedom? I think this gets the relationship between the states and the national government quite wrong. The states don't have significant powers for the sake of convenience or efficiency. The states are rather meant to be serious political entities in their own right. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution reads that, quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The states are not mere administrative units. Any political movement that does not understand this will have trouble succeeding in America. Why? Well, before I explain that, I should clarify something. One of the things that national conservatives say a lot about people like me is that we're just gatekeepers, defenders of the status quo. To the extent we have anything to say, all we can do is criticize people like them, the ones who are actually taking our problems seriously. I obviously disagree with this. As I've outlined tonight, I have serious reservations about the National Conservative Project. But it is true that if all people like me do is critique, we will be seen as defenders of the status quo by default. And I do not like the status quo. It is dissatisfactory in all sorts of ways. And though it remains possible to live a good life in America today, and while there is much that can be achieved through our political system by ordinary means, there is much that needs improvement and even salvaging. But I lack confidence that national conservatives should be the ones to lead such an effort, even if I welcome some of the reinvigorating challenges they have posed to the right, and would not dismiss their support. The contradiction about cronyism and the error about federalism help to explain why I don't think they should lead such an effort. National conservatism, supposedly a challenge to the status quo, might actually double down on it. That's because one of the biggest failures of conservatism in my lifetime is that it has become a business, one increasingly centered out of Washington, D.C. When the Cold War ended, fusionism was seen as no longer relevant. Rather than morphing into liberalism, as Hazony argues, it was largely discarded, as practitioners of other forms of conservatism fought for status and power over the positions that fusionism's success created in the now DC-centered conservative movement. Conservatism lost a focus on not just the culture, but also on the political importance of the states. To the extent that conservatives achieved success in these fields, they were often afterthoughts, exceptions, or even accidents. DC was where it was at. Now, as long as DC is our national seat of government, there will always be some need for a conservative presence here. But if we really believe what we do, the end of our policy should be to minimize that as much as possible. What truly national ends this country has, let's debate them and then do them well. Everything else must be redistributed back to the people and to the states. In my experience of national conservatism, the virtue of such federalism is sometimes forgotten or even deliberately downplayed. Thus, I see in it not a disruption from the centralizing status quo, but a continuation. And some of its proponents, so keen on invoking the people, seem to me like more power-hungry status seekers casting about desperately for a group in whose name they can create a comfortable life in DC or other elite circles for themselves. A new vanguard looking for its new proletariat, if you were. Now, if that's all that national conservatism is, then I'm not interested. Again, I say this as someone who sees many of the same problems they see and who has many of the same political opponents they do. But when I look at these problems, instead of trying to create a new American political tradition or disdaining the conservatism that came before me, I wonder, has the answer been closer than we realized all along? Is the real solution to be found in the shadow of that dome I saw far off in the distance one day many years ago across this campus? In this spirit, I'd like to close by turning to a concern that pervades national conservatism, yet one I have mostly ignored up to this point: the decline of Christianity in public life. Here's a selection from the statement relevant to this. Christianity should be the basis for public life and strongly reflected in government and other institutions wherever a majority of the public so desires. Excuse me, that's from Hazoni's book, not from the statement. Getting to the statement now. But it's a sign of the times, I guess, that a Jewish man living in Israel is so concerned about the fate of Christianity in America. But he is not alone in this concern. I share it also. And you don't have to be an integralist to care. In fact, I think being an integralist is, if anything, counterproductive. But that's definitely beyond the scope of my remarks tonight. So now back to the National Conservatism Statement of Principles, which similarly states that, quote, where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision, which should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private. It then adds that, quote, Jews and other religious minorities are to be protected in the observance of their own traditions, in the free governance of their communal institutions, and in all matters pertaining to the rearing and education of their children. Adult individuals should be protected from religious or ideological coercion in their private lives and in their homes. Now, I don't really know what that means, nor am I entirely confident that talking about state-backed Christianity in this way is consistent with the American political tradition. What established churches did exist in the founding era eventually fell away. But what happened for decades, even centuries after, was a flowering of Christian religious expression in this country. Even as we mourn that this flower seems to be, at the moment, wilting, we should acknowledge this history. And at the same time, Catholics, such as myself, should acknowledge that we have prospered in the institutions the founders left us. It has been enough to inspire, among others, St. Pope John Paul II, who was impressed by the concept of freedom enshrined in our founding documents. He called it a freedom designed to enable people to fulfill their duties and responsibilities towards the family and towards the common good of the community. Thinking of one pope puts me in mind of another, Leo XIII, known well to this campus. When COA was founded, Pope Leo XIII said it should give to the Republic her best citizens. When you combine this with Pope Paul VI's exhortation for the laity to sanctify the world by their actions, I think we're onto something. You here tonight are the ones who can give to this nation what it so desperately needs in your lives, in your churches, and in your communities. How precisely you do it is beyond me to detail here. But I suspect that each of you knows, or at least can learn, what that means for you. And so I end tonight by telling you, do it. Thank you. I trust you to do it.
So just raise your hand.
Well, actually, no, I think it makes more sense for me to do it now that I think about it. Sorry, I only prepared the speech. I didn't prepare what came after. Let's see. Raise your hands if you have a question. Flannel bro, what's up?
Mike, yes, Mike. Doing the mic.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Butler, for coming out tonight. My question is, simple one. What's the alternative? Are we going to continue this conservatism that's business as usual, that's just being squishy, that's just conceding to the left on everything, that's just this type of conservatism that isn't working? Or are we going to actually embrace a conservatism that's in line with the American tradition and conservatism?
Well, I certainly hope it's the latter. But as I outlined in my speech, I think that there are I should clarify, or I'll emphasize, since I said this in my remarks, there are ways in which I think that conservatism, as it's been constituted over the past, basically in my lifetime, has failed seriously. And there are all sorts of ways in which I am extremely uncomfortable with the status quo. But I think that it's well within the scope and the resources that exist within the American political tradition, rightly understood, to mount a challenge to the left in all of the very real places that it is serving as the aggressor. And yeah, it is worth keeping in mind that in these contests, it is the left that is the aggressor in the culture war. And a weird thing about the framework that Hazony creates is that because it's so untethered from the American political tradition and from conservatism as it has been understood, if not perfectly practiced in this nation's history, it ends up not actually being something that has much to go on. It's hard to identify the political coalition around which the Hazonism really forms. It's hard to, and probably the most debilitating aspect of it is that because it lacks such a rooting in the American political tradition, it has less of a strength to conserve. Whereas I think that what actually is an authentic understanding of the American political tradition and of conservatism has the resources to push back against the left, which I should emphasize the left needs to be pushed back against. So do not take me for some mere defender of the status quo, as I tried to emphasize in my speech. Vest, black vest, front row.
Yes. How can limited government make social conservatism stronger? Like how you're saying, instead of picking up these values from the left, using a strong national government, and instead empowering the states to do that?
Well, I should clarify that, as I said in the speech, there are certain national ends I think the national government should have. But one of those ends, I think there's something that if I'm looking to form a coalition to agree on for things, I think an easy place to start is defunding things. Where there is existing federal support of things that go after social conservatism or weaken it. I mean, that seems to me to be the left trying to violate in important ways what the American political tradition is. And that just seems like a very easy place to start. There are many steps that would have to go beyond that. I think, though, that ultimately those steps will, as I tried to imply in the end of my speech, it's going to be incumbent upon a serious restoration of these kind of enervated forms of government that our political system does provide for, but that have been atrophied. And one way they've been atrophied, in fact, is by this excessive commingling of national government, the national government with the states. And so I think that's another area in which a real agenda can be furthered and ascertained, is just starting by weakening these centers of national government power that have pushed something that is sort of unrecognizable or alien to the American political tradition. I think that would be a good start, at any rate. Anyone else? Let's see, how can I describe you? Red lanyard, half zip. Quarter zip, right, sorry.
So first of all, thank you for coming tonight. Really engaging lecture. My question was, so you invoke the JP2 quote, where he mentions the common good. What role this is kind of a two-part question.
Two parts.
What role do you believe the common good plays in the American tradition, if any? And do you believe that conservatism is merely just a project of defending liberalism?
I'll start with the common good part of the question. And yeah, the answer is yes. And this is one area in which, as I tried to express, there are certain respects in which I'm grateful for the reinvigorating challenges that national conservatism has imposed. So to the extent that the common good was seen as a kind of dirty word by generations of conservatives or anything like that, I think this may be slightly exaggerated, but to the extent it was true, I am glad that this term, which I think has a very powerful meaning and a rich tradition in our nation's history, has been revived, and we're now talking about it a lot more. So yes, I think it has a tremendous place in the American political tradition. So as for the second part of the question, I would say it is not the America does not merely exist to defend liberalism. I think So it's complicated, but it's a complex matrix of ideas and sentiments that went into the founding and creation of the American Republic. What you can describe liberalism, or at least in the adjectival form, a liberal system, which is a term that the founders used to describe various things they did as part of this. But no, I think the definition of liberalism these days in many quarters has been attributed and abused to essentially mean like, okay, whatever the left happens to stand for, that's liberalism. And you see it's a similar thing to what you see with what's been happening lately with Joe Biden and other Democrats talking about protecting our democracy. Like what they mean by democracy is us getting our way. So it's a complicated matrix. I think liberalism, or something you can understand as liberalism, is part of it, but the founders never imagined liberalism as being the sole component of what they created. It was always going to depend on what you might call pre-liberal virtues for its sustenance that exist in a complicated matrix of the institutions set out in our federalist architecture. So yeah, there's my answer. Anyone else? Left gray, double gray man. Wasn't that a movie on Netflix that just came out? The Gray Man?
I think it might have been,
Yeah. Well, that doesn't matter unless you happen to be asking about the movie, which I haven't seen, so don't ask me about it.
I'm not.
Okay, that's a
but
relief.
I was wondering if you think that a national conservative political agenda is electorally viable or not.
Is it electorally viable? I always have this trouble because now, as I'm aging, almost 30, I don't know if my cultural touchstones are the same as yours. So do you guys know what 8 balls are? Yes. So you shake an 8 ball, one of the answers, too soon to tell. I think I could just say that, but no, I'll give you a little more to go on. I think it's uneven at best. So here's a good example. And by saying this, I'm putting myself at the possible risk of being confounded by events, but that is the risk of all such predictions. So I'm from Ohio. I love Ohio. I don't understand why you Zoomers have made Ohio a meme. I would love if someone could explain that to me. But in Ohio right now, you have J.D. Vance running in the Senate race against Tim Ryan, and you have Mike DeWine. These are both Republicans. Vance is a Republican, and then you have Mike DeWine, Republican, running against Nan Whaley. So Mike DeWine is the incumbent governor. Nan Whaley is the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. And right now, there's a pretty large disparity in the polls between DeWine and Vance. DeWine is doing much better. And if you want to, I have all sorts of problems with DeWine. As one example, he right when the COVID lockdown started, he was an aggressive COVID lockdown guy, and he suspended these primary elections that were happening right then, and people did not like this. And in fact, his daughter was running for a race then that she ended up losing. So I have my problems with DeWine, but if you wanted to personify normie establishment republicanism, it would be Mike DeWine. He's held all of these elected offices in the state, basically everyone. He's been senator, attorney general, lieutenant governor. It's just been everything. But right now, DeWine is doing much better than Vance is. Vance has been polling. I guess I've seen the biggest poll that has him ahead by 4 points. And he may well win by more than that, but I would be surprised if he ended up winning by more than DeWine did. And so I don't know. I mean, it seems that for one thing, national conservatism is still being defined and still sorting out its loose ends. But some of its loose ends, I think, are electorally challenging. And I think they've been not boons, but defects for the electoral prospects of people who identify or would identify as national conservatives. Not to say that my ideal for Republican politics is Mike DeWine, but this is an interesting test case, and I will be interested to see if the polling ends up bearing this out, as I suspect it probably will. Yes, in the back. Wait for the mic, please.
I'll show up eventually. Great.
Hokey pokey.
Thanks for coming tonight. Quick question for you. Who is right about drag queen story hour? David French or Sorba Mari?
Oh boy, I expected I was going to be asked about this. I should, yeah, because that was what, 3 years ago around this time? Yep. So that was a very interesting debate, and I have problems with both sides of this debate. I think you have to recognize, or at least appreciate, Sohrab Ahmari, who has not yet blocked me on Twitter, his, you might call it his thumos, in recognizing the weirdness of a drag queen story hour. But in that COA debate, he did not really offer a solution to the problem of drag queen story hours. His solution seemed to be, I'm very mad about this. On the other hand, David French's arguments about the neutral public square, in a technical procedural sense, they had an element of truth to them. I mean, I think it is true that we have these public spaces that can be used by anyone, are also used by Christians, but his argument really made it seem like he did not care or find anything weird about Drag Queen Story Hour at all. So I guess I'm somewhere like in this bizarre middle between the two of them, where I think a Drag Queen Story Hour is something certainly not to be celebrated, and I think that like if you have, so if on the Twitter account Libs of TikTok, for example, all these weird public school teachers, like if there's evidence that like on a state level that this stuff has worked its way into state curricula, I don't really see a problem with people empowered in our federalist architecture altering curricula and changing funding mechanisms to over the institutions that political power has given them control of. But the Sohrab Ahmari, I didn't see evidence that he had. Basically, if I remember correctly, his proposal was to like drag the heads of the Modern Library Association in front of a congressional hearing and have Josh Hawley like yell at them angrily for a few minutes. I'm sure that would be great for Josh Hawley and maybe great in a secondhand sense for Sohrab Ahmari, but I don't think that would actually accomplish anything. It would make everyone angry. People might get more Twitter followers out of it, but I just don't see what the actual recourse is there. So yeah, that's about where I come down on that. Back, is that a leather jacket?
It's a barber jacket.
Okay, I don't know what that is, but sure.
Good evening, Mr. Butler. Thank you for coming. So we've talked a bit about federalism and integralism tonight. So
only a little bit about integralism.
So
a tiny bit.
So my question for you tonight is, do you support a DOMA or a DOMA equivalent, especially in light of the recent overturn of Roe v. Wade?
I see. So right now, I mean, I'm trying to be practical here. Right now, the struggle about recognition of same-sex marriage in the law at a national level, there's a bill that the Senate or that Congress is trying to pass, and I know that sometimes people like me are criticized for being caught in this caught in this position of defensive crouch liberalism. I'll crouch for you just to emphasize it. But it seems to me the first order of priority is to stop that bill from happening. As for a federal DOMA amendment, I mean, this is something, for all we say about, for all I said and for all that is said about criticism of conservatives before the present moment, this is something that the Bush presidency was very into. I mean, in Ohio, my home state, in 2004, there was a state constitution, there was an amendment of the state constitution to recognize marriage as between a man and a woman. So, it's also the case that a lot of the actions on same-sex marriage, they have rarely been sort of, how do I put this? The democratic legitimacy of them has never been fully rooted. In certain places it was voted on, but even as recently as 2008 in California, for example, I mean, that California recognized in law marriage between a man and a woman. The tricky thing is, and here I'll be criticized by, if there are any integralists in the room, for having insufficient imagination. I think the preparation in the cultural space for something like that is a good ways off. And now this is tricky because it is often said that politics is downstream from culture, Usually, I think that's true, but it's slightly more complicated than that. The law does can influence people's behavior. So I am not going to completely reject the moral tradition of the law as a teacher. But while I would share that as an ultimate aim, I mean, think of how long it took for Roe v. Wade to be overturned. That was a 50-year struggle, and that required a lot of hard work. And my fear is that a sort of hasty or rash attempt to impose this at a national level at this particular juncture would lead to a counter reaction that would be almost horrifying in its intensity and swiftness. So I guess to summarize in brief my answer to your question, I share that as an ultimate aim, but I think that will require a long process to get to. So yeah. Anyone else? Let's see. I was entranced by your sweatshirt, so I'll ask Nixon Agnew. He's all the way over there.
So after this one, we have time for 2 more, not including this one.
Sounds good to me.
I hope you're not a crook.
Can't impeach me. I resign. Oh, sorry. All right. So my question is, this whole talk of the national conservative stuff, okay, it just sounds like you're talking about like a new brand of paleoconservatism. That was of the Pat Buchanan tradition, who was tight with Dick Nixon, by the way. And Nixon's daughter also went here for grad school.
Oh, I didn't know
So there
that.
is a Nixon connection. Yes. So
You seem like the kind of person who would know this type of thing.
well, I'm a history major, so you got to know.
Yeah, history
So-
is important.
My question for you is like, how do you interpret this whole mix mash of why are people so divided on what it really means to be a conservative? Okay, you got the paleoconservatives, which really just what these NatCon people seem to be. Your neocons and all these cons. Why can't you just be a conservative again? You know.
Oh, wouldn't it be nice? Well, as I put it in my speech, conservatives have since the beginning of post-war conservatism, we've loved to like. There's been a lot of acrimony internally, and I think this can get out of hand at times. It has gotten out of hand. I think there's a case that within the past couple of years, it's gotten a bit excessive. Certainly on Twitter, where people are quite quick with the block button and with the impetuous tweet. But no, I think that there will always be a tension within different parts of conservatism because there are different parts of the American political tradition that at their best, these different factions within conservatism embody, and also in different circumstances, it may be called for a different virtue and thus a different type of conservatism to be prominent. Now, sometimes you can sort of blow your moment in the sun, as I think it's pretty clear that neocons did. I mean, that by the way that the Iraq War ultimately proceeded, I wouldn't discard all neoconservative insights, but I think, yeah. So there's always acrimony, and the key is to, if you look at conservatism history, as I would recommend Continetti's book again, which is a great guide in this respect, the key is you want good leaders. Oh, to talk about Reagan again for a second, one of the great insights of Continetti's book is that Reagan was able to harmonize these competing strains of conservatism that did exist at the time he was trying to become prominent as a public figure. There were lots of them. They were at each other's throats in the 70s, quite similarly to the way some conservatives are at each other's throats now. And you ideally want people like that. And it doesn't have to just be a simple one good leader doesn't solve all your problems, but having a culture of people who are trying to think about these things in a sober manner, I guess is what can help. I would also, I'm not sure that, to key onto one of your comments about paleocons, it's not, NatCons are not merely paleocons reincarnated. There is something to that. I mean, a lot of NatCons like Pat Buchanan for various reasons, but there's been more to it than that. But that would require another speech to explain fully. And I'm only here for one, at least tonight. Speaking of one, you said we have time for one more? Okay. Catholic University gray shirt, center. Next time, you should all wear clothes with your names on them.
So how can traditional conservatives, neocons, whatever you would like to call what you and I don't know, maybe my eyes seem to be, how can we combat like this nation's problems and the challenges on the like posed by the left without resorting to national conservatism?
Well, wasn't that what I said in the speech? Well, I think there are all sorts of ways to do it, and I think one of the starting points, one of the primary engines of the left's success over the past century has been the creation of the administrative state. And this has distorted our political system in all sorts of ways. And because it was something designed by the left, it basically benefits the left in all of its manifestations. And I think so. You all keep wanting me to say mean things about integralists, so I will. Why not? There's this integralist idea that the administrative state can be harnessed. At its most ridiculous extents, the idea is that the administrative state is somehow like the representation of the popular will. That's nonsense. But to do this, it is important to note, and this is to return to something I said in the speech, it does require, so the administrative state is here. It's all around us. It's on Constitution Avenue, arguably enough, where you have like the IRS and the EPA and all those. And then you have the hideous buildings like HHS and Labor right at the base of the mall. Gosh, they're so ugly. And so it requires some national presence for conservatives. But I think the thing I've been worried about in my assessment of national conservatism is that there has been a kind of left envy that comes out of it, where it's like, well, we have this giant bureaucratic machinery. What if we just find a way to push all the levers right, and it can be the administrative state for good? No, administrative state will not get anywhere until that is seriously restrained, and that will require. So there are people who emphasize that a conservatism that does not take political power seriously won't accomplish anything. Even people who want, like me, to reduce the administrative state will have to get inside of it to do something. I mean, that seems obvious to me. But the trick is to make sure once you get there that you're not suddenly staring longingly into its bowels and wondering like, what if I just put myself on top of this? And then, because the moment you do that is the moment you end up like some cog in the beltway machinery for the rest of your life, and you become part of the very status quo that I have tried to emphasize I do not like and that I am not a defender of. So that's a good start, I think. Administrative state has to be seriously curtailed. And there are people who have lots of ideas about this and who are in DC right now, working on it, scheming, trying to figure out how to do it. And I wish them the best of luck. Yep, that's all.
All right. So let's give a round of applause for Mr. Butler. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.